Racism and Interfaith Relations. Dr. Jamila N. Morgan is an associate professor of law and the Robert D. Glass Scholar at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Her current scholarship focuses on issues of the intersection of race, disability, and criminal law and punishment. She has been working diligently with many wonderful projects, and we're going to hear from her. She will be our lead person that will kick it off. Following her presentation will be Imam Kashif Abdul Kareem, who just came up here with a beautiful stick. I didn't know whether he just wanted to look good or if he needed it. He is a graduate of the University of Connecticut, and he has been working in the community and within his own mosque, and has been doing tremendous work. He worked for a time as a Islamic chaplain in the state of Connecticut, retiring in 2004, and he doesn't stop working because he's no longer there. He's still working in and for the community. And then the Reverend Dr. Valerie Holly, who is a senior minister at Judson Memorial Church. I say a senior minister, senior community minister at Judson Memorial Church, and in New York. She is a teacher and preacher, and among all of her duties, some of which are related to the community food pantry, HIV and AIDS education, Dr. Holly is a teacher, preacher, and she's also does work in prisons as well. We will hear from each of them, and we will have a wonderful, robust dialogue immediately afterwards. Let me turn over the mic and to Dr. Jamila Morgan.
Good evening, everyone.
Yep, it's on.
Is it on?
Yep.
It's such an honor to be here. As your introduction mentioned, I teach at UConn School of Law, and it's been a real privilege to be able to be in this space and think broadly about my work, and the intersections between spirituality and some of the work that I do has been really informative over the last couple days. So thank you to Dr. David Grafton for the invitation and the opportunity to be here, and for all of the faculty members and staff that have coordinated this event, this 2-day-long conference, to my panelists, to our moderator. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So, because I've been here for 2 days, I've been inspired by the personal stories that people are sharing, and I feel empowered as the lawyer in the room and a professor to maybe start with a personal story for why I find myself here. So I grew up in a diverse community outside of Los Angeles, and I was raised actually in a Pentecostal Christian church. The last 2 days have been really reflective for me because it sort of helped me think through how it is that experience now informs the work that I do in prisons. And so I've made like 3 general observations. Really, it's off the cuff. I wasn't planning on doing this, but again, inspired by the personal stories and the courage that's been displayed over these last 2 days, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've learned from the Pentecostal tradition as a Christian, and how I'm applying that to my work in prisons. So I actually was introduced to prison ministry through the Pentecostal church. We had a prison ministry, and in fact, as children, we were given opportunities to visit with incarcerated people. What that taught me was that it in many ways destigmatized incarceration and imprisonment. It was socially acceptable in that church to break bread with, to be in conversation with incarcerated people. And I think in many ways of my work today, it's a lot about destigmatizing incarceration and those who have been imprisoned for what society has labeled as crimes. And so that started in my church, Christian Chapel. I'll name the church here. In addition, and sort of relatedly, through the faith I understood, and this is what also informs my abolitionist practice today as a lawyer, as someone that's using the law as a tool to enact radical transformative change, particularly around the areas of prisons and policing. I learned that crime is a social construction. Now, how do I learn this from my Pentecostal tradition? Well, as a kid and as looking back, there's a conflict. If all criminal acts are bad and if crime leads to imprisonment because one commits crimes, and how do we explain the incarceration of the disciples? How do we explain Christ being an enemy of the state? So at some point, there's a tension in my mind between what we choose to criminalize and how the act of criminalization is a political act, is based in part on what society chooses to condemn, which may not actually align with what is inherently morally wrong or bad. The third observation, again informed by the Pentecostal tradition of service, is, and I'm borrowing this from Brian Stevenson, an incredible lawyer, death penalty lawyer who works on behalf of people that have been sentenced to death by the state, that true service, and this isn't something that's specific to the Christian religion, but it's informed by it for me in my personal experience, one has to be proximate to the pain. And so as somebody that grew up not only experiencing police violence through my father's interactions with the police, but also prison and incarceration through the incarceration of members in my own family, I learned in part that pain and the impacts of incarceration require acts of courage for those of us that engage with the law, that are using the law to enact change. It requires being proximate to those that are experiencing pain and using the privileges that we have to address those conditions. So I guess I just start with that, and now I'll launch into kind of what I do. So I study prisons. Through the lens of law. What's been looping through on the slides has been photos of solitary confinement cells juxtaposed next to sites of worship in prisons. And it's interesting because if you think about those two sites, the solitary confinement cell and the place of worship in prison, they seem diametrically opposed. Solitary confinement is a place where individuals are sent because they are deemed to be safety and security risks to the institution. They may be put in solitary confinement for their own protection, as in the case of trans communities, as in the case of individuals who have disabilities. And then you see the site of places of worship. And in many cases, the places of worship offer incarcerated people not only a chance to practice their faith, to connect with a higher being, but also to fellowship and engage in community. So the isolation of solitary juxtaposed next to the community of these worship spaces are these two sort of polar opposites that you find in carceral spaces, prisons, jails, immigrant detention centers, things of that nature. So in reflecting on this question, interfaith dialogues, interfaith relationships, I think of the prison as a site for that, a place where incarcerated people, Muslim prisoners in partnership with Christian prisoners, in partnership with prisoners who practice Judaism, have engaged in acts of coordinated resistance to harsh conditions of confinement. So coordinated hunger strikes, the August 20th strikes of last year that were not necessarily covered by the media, but definitely gripped the nation of incarcerated people, were hunger strikes against attempts to undermine the humanity of incarcerated people. And so coordinating these hunger strikes and work stoppages were huge acts of sort of interfaith dialogue in many ways. It required coordination despite state attempts to block communication. It required putting aside any sort of conflicts that may have existed in these carceral spaces in an effort to resist racism. So I'm thinking about that as one example of sort of these interfaith communities coming together to say, that we are humans, that we deserve the right to be treated as such, not only while we're incarcerated, but after. And so some of the demands were things like access to the courts, the access to the right to vote after incarceration, the right to be treated humanely while incarcerated, and of course the right, in many contexts, to practice one's faith free of intrusion. And so a lot of the constitutional law cases that you'll see in this area involve access to religious diets, access to congregate programming, again, that fellowship aspect, the aspect of faith that requires us all to come together in community, the ability to adhere to standards of dress and decorum are constrained in prisons. And so advocating on the one hand, one person's practice of faith can in fact impact another's practice of faith by, let's say, requiring the prison under law to look at how prison diets are distributed, for instance, or in the case of one of my clients, a Jewish prisoner who wanted access to congregate program as a requirement of his faith, he was required to do so. His victory in court meant that other incarcerated people who practice other faiths had that right to now practice in congregate programming, despite the fact that they were in solitary confinement. And so thinking about in the various ways how courageous individuals, I'm also thinking about, Dr. Ansari, your story about the incarcerated Black Muslim woman whose act of courage now is going to have implications for the entire BOP system because of her courage in standing up on her religious freedoms. It will have an impact. So these interfaith dialogues are not nominal in the prison context. They matter. They're not superficial. They go to the heart of affirming the humanity of all incarcerated people. And they also, when the law is engaged, can be a tool to provide basic human rights in a space where I would argue incarcerated people are routinely denied them. So solitary confinement, as I am trying to explain, is one site for this shared struggle. For those that don't know, solitary confinement is 22 hours a day lockdown in conditions amounting to torture. And this is language that comes from the United Nations, not me as the advocate. It comes from the religious communities. And it also comes from, if we think about its origins, from ideologies that were based, solitary confinement is attributed to the Quakers, and for good reason they've resisted that. But there were religious communities out of the Christian faith tradition that advocated for solitary confinement in the 19th century as a way to encourage incarcerated people to spend time in solitude, to think about the crimes that they had committed, and to repent. And so in many ways, you think about the penitentiary as coming from penitence. This is where it comes from. So I see that my time is up, but I want to leave us with something. So if we think about the origins of these systems that we now call torture, what responsibility do faith communities now have to address these conditions? I leave you with a couple organizations that are interfaith communities that are doing work to undo this legacy of solitary confinement in particular and advocate on behalf of incarcerated people. The Interfaith Action for Human Rights, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. They have been working across faith communities to address the conditions of isolation that characterize the prisons in this country. Over 80,000 people, we believe, on any given day are in conditions amounting to solitary confinement. And for dialogue, thinking broadly about interfaith solidarity, what it looks like to resist state violence in this day and age. The churches are uniquely situated, the mosques are uniquely situated, the synagogues are uniquely situated to protect vulnerable groups from state power. I'm thinking about the churches, the mosques, the synagogues that are protecting undocumented immigrants from deportation. I'm thinking about, in many ways, the churches that have, and the mosques and the synagogues that have offered places of restoration for formerly incarcerated individuals dealing with substance use disorders. And at the same time that they have this proximity to state power and this ability to protect, they too are vulnerable to violence. I'm thinking of the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand. I'm thinking of the shooting deaths of the 9 Black worshipers in South Carolina. So I leave that for discussion, this proximity to state power, the opportunities to protect vulnerable communities, and the disproportionate exposure to state violence because of these worship spaces that I argue have been racialized. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means may the peace, blessings, and mercy that can only come from Almighty God be upon you. We have 10 minutes to go through a very hectic and very interesting, needed conversation. But I'd like to first of all begin by addressing the very important point that African American Muslims and converts to the religion of Islam, once they said La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, immediately started interfaith dialogue. Interfaith dialogue is not something that's new to the African American Muslim community or to the interfaith community, because as soon as we took Shahada, as soon as we became Muslim, we went home and we had to explain to our mothers, we had to explain to our families, our children, and our friends why we're Muslim, and quite often we had to defend why we had to turn to the religion of Islam. So this idea of interfaith dialogue is something that's not new to us. I remember in particular when I first became Muslim over 35 years ago. After I took Shahada, my mother, she came to the masjid and she talked to my imam and she said to the imam, what is he doing? Is he part of now a cult? They wanted to know what kind of religion, what kind of thing he had become part of. And when she had finished talking to the imam had said to her that, or made her understand that he believes in the same God, but he just calls him by a different name. That was the understanding that she got from out of that meeting. So then my mother, a Christian, became one of my strongest advocates in explaining and teaching people what it is that I was all about. And that's the environment that I had come into once I became Muslim. Now, this is interesting because when you look at those who are converts to the religion of Islam, or come into or revert to the religion of Islam, most of us have come from out of Christianity or come from out of already believing in God. So what does this mean? This means that at one time, I used to wait for the Easter outfit. I used to wait to ride on the back of the train with, or the back of a fire truck with Black Santa Claus driving it. You know, sitting on Black Santa Claus' lap. We had experienced those things. We saw the white Jesus hanging up in our living room with the gold frame with a little light shining over the top. These are things that we remember, things that were very clear to us, things that don't just disappear. So we start having honest conversations with people about Islam or about Christianity or engaging in those conversations. It means that we have actually lived these things. This is not something that's new to us. We didn't grow up in an environment where there was no Christians. We didn't grow up in an environment where there was no Bible or there wasn't any other kind of text. This is the environment we grew up in, so it became easy for us to engage in these conversations all along. Quite often, many of our family members who did not become Muslim, they then started embracing Islamic tenets. Like I know, like my mother, she stopped eating pork. My sister stopped eating pork. People around my family, those who call themselves very good Christians, they began to adapt their doctrine or their understanding of the religion to fit in with what our belief system is. What do I mean by that? I mean, like, they would be asked a very simple question. If there is a heaven and we're going to heaven, what's heaven going to be like without Kashif there? What's it going to be like to not have your mother in paradise beside you? If you believe that your way is the only way, and the only way to enter paradise is through Jesus. And if you accept that just as that doctrine teaches, is there a passageway or is there a way for us to be together again in paradise together? So we began to find that quite often people who were of a particular doctrine or dogmatic in their doctrine began to become very flexible in terms of their belief system, in terms of things that they believe, how they interpreted their own scriptures to make it comfortable to fit in with everybody, what everybody else was doing, in particular myself, other people in my association. So Islam, like I said, was never something new to the African American community. We've been involved with the African community ever since the plantations. They knew about us on the plantations. When we were engaging in the 30s through the Nation of Islam into the movement established by Imam Muhammad, people knew the African American Muslims and what we're all about, what we're doing. They knew what we stood for. They saw us fighting for social justice. They saw us in the communities. They saw us engaged and involved in all those different kinds of things. It wasn't until 9/11 that the whole framework changed. Then the idea or the identity of what a Muslim is began to change from what America was used to the new image of terrorism that was being painted as Muslims in America. So instead of seeing Muslims in America the way they saw Imam Muhammad, the way they saw Minister Louis Farrakhan and others, they began to now see Islam as a form of terrorism. And they saw a new image of Islam in America, of predominantly immigrants, and began to ignore the people who had been part of this country all along. That had always been part of this country, that had always been proving itself Islamically. And again, this is very controversial because we were involved in the interfaith dialogues at the Jubilees. We were involved in the interfaith dialogues at all the churches. I remember doing the sermon on a Sunday morning at a church here, Faith Congregational Church, here in Hartford, Connecticut. So we've always been involved with the idea of interfaith dialogue. Many other groups, however, began to get involved with interfaith dialogue just recently, after 9/11, because they were pressured to have to do so. They quite often would have to compromise on their statements of what they were saying because they didn't fully understand how to talk about issues that they were not familiar with. So it became a problem with interfaith dialogue being introduced into the country. For example, when I look at Islamic chaplaincy, I was the president emeritus of the Muslim Endurance Council for Connecticut chaplains for like 7 years. And one of the problems that we would see is that quite often when Muslims became chaplains, the idea of a Muslim chaplain really doesn't exist. You really are an interfaith chaplain because everybody you work with, you have to be able to work with every single person in the institution that you're working for. You can't be working for just Muslims. You have to work with all these different individuals. So what does this mean? This means that if you're in a hospital and you go up to somebody and they ask you to pray for them, are you able as a Muslim to pray for a person who's not Muslim? Are you able to answer the question and they're on their dying bed and they're dying and they ask you to pray for them and they say, what do I have to do to go to heaven? Am I going to heaven? Am I going to paradise? What do I have to do to make that happen? How are you going to respond? How are you going to be trained to know these particular ways to answer and respond to these questions that are based on interfaith relationships? How are you going to respond and how are you going to answer those particular things? So, and I'm running out of time. I really believe, and we skip ahead, that the idea of interfaith dialogue has been so long, has taken place so long in the African community, it's now time for us to move actually further along in the equation. We need to move more towards what I call interfaith service. And interfaith service is not talking about what we believe in. To you be your way, to me be mine. But we have to find out what are the common human concerns that we have that we need to address, that we can address, that we all have in common with as people of faith. Issues such as healthcare, issues that deal with the whole idea of healing, the whole idea of prison reentry, the ideas of education, poverty. All of those are common things that all people of faith identify with and feel like we should all work on together. And when we work on these things together, they see the Muslims not eating pork. They see us when we're working for Habitat for Humanity and we're building houses together, right? They see us stopping to make prayer. They see us doing these things and they say, wow, these Muslims, they do certain things a certain type of way. oh, the Christians have a special love for these people. I see that, and they're demonstrating it. We can see those kind of things demonstrated active in our lives. So we need to move towards what we consider interfaith services. The last point, and I know I'm running out of time, is that we need to also move, especially among the Muslim community, away from just interfaith dialogue to intra-faith dialogue, where we need to really work on Muslims talking to other Muslims, Christians talking to other Christians about the whole ideas and things that we have in common that we need to work on. How do we, as Muslims in America, address the domestic concerns that Muslims in America have? These are quite often concerns that I have while I'm trying to raise money to build schools, to build hospitals, to build universities, to build things that will help us domestically in America. They're asking me to contribute our resources to help the people in Yemen, to help the people in Palestine or Pakistan or wherever. And there's nothing wrong with raising funds to do that. But at the same time, I'm interested in domestic concerns that are happening here. How do we then discuss this so that we can establish a balance in what is good for all of us to be able to do things? These are things that require interfaith discussions, things that require us to be able to find out what separates culture from religion, what separates our ideas of traditionalism, what people traditionally get caught up with what is actually religious scripture and religious law. How do we get people to follow what Allah says in the Quran or was demonstrated by a prophet instead of what you've learned by what your father did in the land that you come from? These are kind of things that require much dialogue and, again, much conversation. My time is up, I'm sure, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of our concerns. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Hartford Seminary and Dr. Grafton for this opportunity. As I was introduced as being senior community minister at Judson Memorial Church, which is located in the West Village in New York City. However, I want to just step back a bit from that. Before coming to Judson, I was at Unity Fellowship Church of New York City, which is located in Brooklyn. For about 22 years, I spent 8 years there as the senior pastor. And one of the things that came out of my time at Unity, which is predominantly LGBTQ people of faith, what came out of that was an understanding of what it is to be marginalized, what it is to be hated, what it is to be demeaned, disrespected, and stereotyped. And so when I went into seminary, you know, they have that 1 year in most seminaries. You have to go to a different seminary. Although for pastors, you don't really have to do that. But I thought, okay, let me do something different. I want to go to a different system and go to another church and experience that. And so I went to New York Theological Seminary, which is where I graduated from. And I spoke to their person that's over that department. And she said, well, you know, Valerie, there is a church that, because I said to her, look, I can't go to a church that's going to be about hating people. I'm not doing that anymore. I cannot go to a church that wants me to wear purple lipstick and not green. I can't do that either. I have to go where there's going to be about some love and some inclusivity. She said, well, you know, there's a church in the village. Right away, I was excited about that. It was in the village, near the park. And she said, however, there is one caveat. It's 95% white. And I said, okay, they're part of the American Baptist churches, and they're part of United Churches of Christ, UCC, ABC. I said, all right, well, this should be fun. Let's go here. And then I thought, and she said something else that stood out. They were about social justice work. And I thought, oh, I'm right at home now, because at Unity Fellowship, that was a big part of our work. Well, I get to Judson, and I realize I really don't know that much about social justice. because at Judson Memorial Church, there was a lot of interest in all types of social justice in areas that I didn't even realize. One of the stories that was told to me about Judson, and Judson has been around since 1890. Back in the 70s, the then pastor would go around in a yellow school bus in the winter looking for sex workers. It was cold. And they were looking for people that were standing outside in their job, doing their job, not to proselytize, not to hate on them, but to offer them to come inside a warm building and receive a hot chocolate or a warm coat. Or did you need a ride to the hospital? That just pressed upon my heart because it spoke to what I wanted to say that Judson believes in, which is we are all people. Everybody is a part of a particular silo of persons. And Judson doesn't turn anyone away. And so that just stayed with me. And so for the last 6 or 7 years at Judson Memorial Church, there has been a community there that Judson hosted, Muslim Community Network. And this particular network of folks come to the church and be able to have their programming there, where the objective from the MCN program is to become a diverse Muslim and non-Muslim community to facilitate opportunities for education, for dialogue, and for learning together and being able to address similar concerns. So that they would have programming where, even though they know they're in a church that's predominantly Christian, it doesn't matter because we recognize that they are part of the silo that I remember in seminary that Martin Buber, European theologian, would talk about in his discussion about the I, thou, and I, it format that he had, which I thought was just lovely. That when you see another person, that person is an I, thou. I, thou means I basically know that the God that's in me is in you. Whether you happen to be a Christian, whether you happen to be someone that is Muslim, or you of the Jewish faith, or Hindu, or no faith, the point is, as a person, as that person, you are God's person too. And that's the I, thou part of Martin Buber's work. The I, it part, though, sees, yes, you are a person. Oh, you are a tall person that's Jewish. Oh, you are a short person that is Christian. And then there's something tagged on to that. Perhaps there is a label tagged on to it that's stereotyped. Perhaps there's a label tagged on to it that's fear-based. Perhaps there's a label tagged on to it that clearly just doesn't understand. But that's what Martin Buber talks about, seeing the I, thou in a person and not the I, it. So that really stayed with me because it helps me understand I really don't have to know anything about you except that I know you exist. And by knowing you exist, you're part of the silo, of God's silo. And even in Judson, we recognize that Dr. King, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they also had this understanding that the church has a responsibility to people that are being oppressed. That the Muslims in the village or in the subways having fear that people are going to attack them, then that's the community that we have to work with and help support in getting these situations corrected. When Black Lives Matter protests would occur and opportunities for people to show up and demonstrate their concern, the MCN program linked arms along with Judson Memorial Church, along with our Jewish brothers and sisters, walked arm in arm with us around those protests. Protests against the New Sanctuary Coalition, immigrants that are people that are trying to stay in this country who've been here 40 years, and because of mistakes 30 years ago, folks are trying to send them out. They also joined, MCN joined in that. LGBTQ rights, women's rights to choose, concerns for other marginalized groups. We have a new program now that one of our ministers brought to our attention, and And I must say, before I became a pastor, I spent 30 years in social work. And my field of expertise was around addictions. And so when this community minister said she wanted to have a program predominantly for people who utilize drugs and let them know that the church is there for them as for anyone else, and we're not pressing on them to get clean. Well, right away, I had concern on that. And my real concern was, wait a minute. You know, I'm old school, helping people out. You want them to understand that this addiction is causing them pain. But then she helped me realize, Valerie, get out of your clinical head and get in your pastoral head, get in your spiritual head. This is a person who is much more than their addiction. This is still God's child. And if they want to come into our church and have an opportunity to understand that God is a God of hope, of opportunity, of love and support, they do not have to be completely sober. They may still struggle with that, and you have to see that. And when I took off that clinician's cap, I understood it because it made sense. Because in my 30 years of work, so many people have come to me based upon feelings that the church was not available to them. And they were interested in wanting to be connected to the church, whether they had concerns about addiction, or even now, even the work at Danbury that I do with women in prison, sometimes not being able to recognize the mistakes they made as a mistake and believe that the church or any type of spiritual place would not accept them. And so I understood that we have to help folk understand that what you believe and you're a person of faith, you don't have to believe like I do. We have to understand that if someone is attacking you, they're attacking us, because the silo is ours, is of people. And I understood that as well with not only Dr. King and Bonhoeffer, but also Dolores Williams with womanist theology. Would help to understand that this is all about people, that any kind of oppression is our oppression, even oppression that relates to women in situations of domestic violence, and not knowing that they have a voice, and that God is a God that addresses oppressions, and if you're being oppressed in situations like that, that is also our concern. So in wrapping this up, I wanted to note that spiritual principles that offer hope, that offer God's love and support, and including all of us without, as what's been said for the last 2 days, without it having to be done and presented directly and as explicitly or specifically as my religion, doesn't have to be that way, because we're still God's people. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists who have done a tremendous job. We're getting ready to open up for questions. Each of you have challenged us in various ways. Dr. Jamila, you are just fantastic in bringing us into your work with prisons and even helping us to understand projecting religious rights and the rights of humanity upon our prisons. It dawns on me that on a systemic level, that may be an area where we may be able to work together, the Black church and the Black mosque, to think about how we can aid in those issues related to recidivism, related to the right to practice one's faith religiously. There may be some areas there that we might be able to find some common ground, that we might be able to do something beyond just the dialogue here. It seems as though there are some opportunities there. And even in terms of thinking collaboratively about how we increase the pool of persons who are willing to serve on juries. because juries now are being populated by registration rolls, but in many cases, juries people are not actually serving on juries and are taking exceptions rather than serving. And in many cases, those young men and women that go of color there to the court end up with juries that have no reflection of who they are. Just thinking out loud of ways we might be able to think together. Again, there are a lot of questions that can be asked. I'll open up the floor, but you can speak to that one before we start in terms of prison reform, prison justice.
Sure, I'll just say that. Sorry. I totally agree. I think that there are existing collaborations that have been very fruitful. The interfaith community has incredible persuasive power with lawmakers, the moral authority, we call it, in advocacy. So especially when we think about historically marginalized and politically unpopular groups like incarcerated people, people that we knew, that we grew up with, that come from our communities, faith communities have a role to play in humanizing them. And so I would agree with you. I think that there's some advocacy networks that many folks in this room may be connected with already, but can link up to, specifically focused on what's happening in our prisons.
Let me open up the floor for questions. I have two questions, Bilal, and then my brother here. Microphone is coming. Please speak into the microphone. We can all hear you and record.
Yes. So again, I thank you all. My question is to you, Dr. Morgan. In the prison, as a prison chaplain for 16 years, Muslim. I was a Muslim prison chaplain, and I want to hold that distinction, but I deal with that on another level. But as a Muslim, prison chaplain, one of the attacks on the practice of faith within the prison for Muslims that were distinguished from the Christian practitioner of faith and the Muslim practitioner of faith, that within the policies and laws, they said that the demonstrative prayer was prohibited. And so Muslims pray bowing, standing, kneeling, but the Christians could gather in a circle and hold hands and raise their hands, but that was not like prohibited. But the Muslim prayer was prohibited by that terminology, that was used. And I'm wondering what legally can we do in the state of this state of Connecticut, where that terminology is used as a weapon to break up the practice of Muslim worship.
So that's good. This has been very informative for me, so it's good to know specifically. That's in the policy, which makes it easier from a legal standpoint to go after a written policy as opposed to a practice. The legal standard is, based on the First Amendment, and so a religious practice can't be substantially burdened, and the policy has to be legitimately connected to a penological state interest, just in the terms of the law, rationally related to a penological state interest. And it's not clear that there's a rational relationship between how demonstrative prayers take place under the Christian faith versus Islam. And so, we should definitely talk, because I would imagine there's incredible organizations like the Muslim Advocate Network. It's a group of lawyers that go around and challenge faith practices in state prisons. And I'm not sure if I've seen this particular issue highlighted, but just knowing sort of the law, this doesn't seem to even meet that basic test. What is the penological, I'm just curious, what could be the penological justification for that? As a critical scholar of race, I think about religion in prison as racialized. And so thinking about the practice of Christianity versus the practice of Islam, we are looking at, in many cases, incarcerated Black men and Black women practicing Islam. And so that is going to be looked at as a different security threat than those that are not. And so our prisons in particular, the places of worship are racialized. And I practice in many states, but Pennsylvania is coming to mind. We think about the prisoners there, And in many cases, the number of people that are in solitary confinement, I mean, through the roof, as I've told you, about 80,000, but disproportionately Black, disproportionately Muslim. And so, this is state by state data that I'm referencing, but thinking about what that means, these worship spaces are racialized, but in this case, there might be a legal solution.
There's a question over here, right in front of you. You use the microphone.
Oh, okay. My name is Jeff. Hi. I had a couple questions. I hope that's okay. The first one was, I was raised in Barbados, and so I didn't experience any kind of what I would call overt racism until I came here. And then not being American, it didn't impact me in the same way as somebody that was actually born here. Even though it bothered me, I felt it. I didn't have as violent a reaction to it, or it wasn't something that was like in my family, that I would have to think about it in that way. So what I wanted to know was, and so as a Christian, the way I approached it was, I want to see where God is leading me. If I'm having an issue at my work, maybe the Holy Spirit is putting me in a place so that I can minister to someone. And I want to know how, Muslim communities react to racism, say, for example, at work, and how they feel like, God is working with them at the job, for example. Then the second pretty easy question is, why is Islam attractive to Black inmates? It seems more than Christianity. That seems to be what I'm hearing. I don't know if that's true. But if that is true, I want to know what's causing that.
Imam, you want to?
I think it's a matter of perspective of what's more attractive in the institution, because I see men coming to Christianity and Islam in the prisons, both in large numbers. And I think it depends really on the leadership of who's in the prison doing the particular services that makes it more attractive to different people. I think the reason why a lot of men come into Islam in the institutions is because Islam serves as a tool to overcome oppression. Islam shows a person how to overcome the difficulties that they had in their lives, like equality for women. That's a tool that's in Islam. Overcoming racism, sexism, equality even in property ownership and rights of divorce and inheritance. There's all kinds of rules that are given into Islam that teaches people who, once they become Muslim, they overcome a different type of oppression that they may have been facing. Islam, when a person says, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, they're saying, I believe there's only one master. And that means they have to give up all of their addictions to one master. They have to give up drugs and all kinds of evils, gangs, and all kinds of involvement that's associated with only having one master who's God. So it teaches them that they have to apply Islam to their everyday lives, make it applicable to everyday lives. And quite often, the rules of Islam teaches men who don't have it discipline by talking about praying 5 times a day, goal setting throughout the day. There's all kinds of things that happen in Islam that men hear for the first time. First of all, they're told that they have to be men. They can't be followers. They have to be the maintainers and leaders and the people who are out front in all of these kind of things. So men are encouraged to be men in Islam, and not to sit back for anyone else.
Interesting.
And if I could just add to that a little bit, from a Christian perspective, in some churches, there isn't, as the doctor started talking, her church started early going into places that people were incarcerated. Yet in many places, that was not the norm. In many places, folks that have been in prison or have addiction, no one talks about you, be you male or female that have been in prison. And if they do make reference to you, a lot of times, not always, A lot of times it's in a negative vein. And so if you are a person of faith who wants to continue a connectedness to your God, it's very difficult to do when people don't acknowledge that you exist. And when they do, it's something negative.
Right.
And so one of the things that I do in Danbury and places where I do teach is I teach about a God of grace and of hope and love, and where mistakes does not make you totally a mistake, and that God is still there for us. And I help folks see that even with your imperfections, you've still been blessed. And I help them to see that. So it helps them. But some places, they don't get to see that. Or the expectation is that stereotype again. The expectation is they're going to be beat down.
Right. I've experienced that where you go to church and even though they're saying, you're saved, sorry, you go to church and, a couple of churches where you're saved, but it's still an expectation, well, are you coming to church 3 days a week? Are you praying every day? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? So even though it's like, okay, Jesus was crucified, the work is done, there's still all these works that are creeping in that you have to do, that you have to fulfill in order to be made right. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Any other questions? Jeff? Jeff Ingram.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Thank you to the panel. Very quickly, just want to, I'm super sensitive, and every time I hear the H word, my antennas go up. I think we need to be very careful when we, attempt to label hate in the churches. Our church has a very particular policy in regards to marriage in our sanctuary, and the God's honest truth is we don't hate anyone other than the devil. But beyond that, a couple of things I want to say to the imam. Our church really takes to heart what you have said. In fact, even as I speak, there's a meeting in our church by an organization that is called Connect. Congregations organized for a new Connecticut, and they have done some amazing things and continue to do amazing things, and that is truly an interfaith group. And so we recognize, I'm not going to come to the mosque to worship, have a different understanding of God, etc. But boy, we can get together, we can study, but most importantly, we can work together on social issues. And the last thing I would say in regards to this dialogue as an evangelical Christian in particular, that when we have conversations with others in other religious groups, particularly with Islam, that many times our thinking is influenced beyond America, where we see what may be perceived the lack of reciprocity in Islam, particularly in many of the nations where Islam predominate. I understand that in Saudi Arabia, you cannot be seen with a Bible publicly, and stories like that. So how much do we need to take into consideration Islam on a global basis to have these kinds of conversations, if indeed we are all equal in the eyes of God?
I do think that someone might want to answer, but I think that post 9/11, things changed dramatically in this nation for everyone, and I think everyone is trying to figure out now what to do and how to exist in America, particularly those brothers and sisters who are involved in, who are part of the Islamic tradition, because between the tearing down of civil rights and civil liberties, the racial profiling and the Islamophobia, there's been a marked change in just how people interact in general here in America. And it's for all Muslims, not just black Muslims, but black Muslims have a particular problem because they feel it from all different angles and from different areas. And I know in interfaith dialogue, sometimes we tend to to be concerned about what it means to live out our faith in other areas and even in America. But there are some issues that we can look at locally that we might be able to find some ground on to make life better, both in areas of social justice and even economic empowerment, because there's a great gap growing between what is and y'all excuse me because I'm going to throw this out without offering any data to back it up. There's a gap between the economic wealth of many who are coming in who are Muslims and many who are black Muslims who are here. There's a gap going in how people are developing their local masters and what's going on in terms of fundraising. Well, we experience the same thing in the black church, but we don't have it the same way. If Sherman Jackson is right, and I think Dr. Jackson is, and I really ask you to read it, Dr. Jackson talks about the black church works and has to deal with white racism. He says, but the black mosque has to deal with Arab supremacy. And his concern is that these issues end up conflating. We end up not having the conversation. We end up turning on each other in terms of the black church not being in communication with the black mosque or Muslims in general, and the intra-conversation that needs to happen doesn't necessarily happen. So this today might be an opportunity to get the conversations that we all need to have pointed in some direction.
If I can, I just want to ducktail a little bit on what he just said when he mentioned the word Arab supremacy. Most of us who are African American Muslims, especially from our association, we come from a community that used to work for like Crade, getting rid of images that of the divine. And so when we hear words like Arab supremacy and we deal with people of an Arab background, if that's what you want to label it, people come to you and say to you that Prophet Muhammad was an Arab. And to me, that leads towards moving us towards the same problem that we came out of. So when I hear that kind of language, I remind them that I say, well, what color was Prophet Muhammad? Prophet Muhammad was the color of righteousness. That's how Allah describes color and the color of righteousness. And when they asked Aisha, who is Prophet Muhammad, what was he, how do you describe him? They said he was the Quran walking. He was the creation or the character of the Quran. So when we see that and we hear that, we don't see color that's associated with our prophet. We don't see or allow anyone to bring the idea of a race into supremacy or greatness in that way. We see a color that's based in righteousness, and we see the best of us being those who are most God conscious, have the best regard. And just to tell them what you were saying again about Connect. Connect is a great, fabulous organization in Connecticut that's doing great interfaith work. I was just with Anthony Bennett on Saturday, and we had a great rites of passage program that we were doing at a church in New Haven. And one of the things we did with rites of passage, we exchanged neckties with young boys and we put neckties around their neck and tied a necktie to show that they were going from being boys into men. The idea of, again, interfaith people working together to try to raise up our children, raise up the people in our community to do good and positive things. So Bennett, he was one of the people that was there. We worked on him. He's doing good stuff at Connect. You could tell him, we give the greetings, and it's a good organization.
Here's the beauty of what you just said. That's another program where we can work together. The thing that we need to find, and I wish we had more time, to sit in these spaces together to say, what can we do next? We know we have issues, not with everyone. There's no one way that everyone's thinking. Everybody's all over the place. What can we do together to make the world a better place? What projects? What do you need from? I'm a black pastor. Where can I work with you? That's a great program, and I'm hoping that we'll hook up and continue to put together programs that we can find common ground on, because there's a lot of need, and people of goodwill, we can still practice our individual faith and find a way to make the world a better place. I don't need to proselytize you. I'm comfortable with who you are. And you have to have a place, Howard Thurman says, you have to have a place from which you are bottom by. And then you have to have a place to stand. And if you don't know where you stand, you really can't be in conversation with anyone else. So I'm fine where I stand, but now we can ask each other the question, from where we stand, what do we need from each other to make this thing better? How can we help each other? How can we walk together? And there's enough places we can agree that we can leave aside any disagreements. I've got two, this young man here and then right here. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Dustin. I just want to thank all the panelists and the moderators and the folks who organized this. The last 2 days has been really fruitful. My question is for Dr. Holly. I'm somebody that organizes largely in abolitionist spaces, particularly in Pittsburgh, but all across the nation. We attempt to be in solidarity with folks in Rohingya and folks in Turkey, or the Kurdish women that are resisting American-like prisons, or the folks in Palestine. And I say that because in Pennsylvania, at least, the Nation of Islam is a group that is associated with hate. Southern Poverty Law Center has mentioned it as a hate group. Now, I work in community, so I'm with people on the side of justice. So I don't care if those people are queer, trans, white, black, whoever. And we build together and we work in solidarity that way. We break bread with folks. But one of the things that's very difficult is getting behind the politics of it. So in Pittsburgh, a place where the Nation of Islam is considered a hate group, a place where the Tree of Life shooting happened and 11 people were massacred in the synagogue, which is 5 minutes away from the hood, which is populated by all black people, the politics makes it really difficult. We find refuge in mosques and churches and synagogues, and these are places where we're protected when the police are tear gassing us. But the one thing that's really difficult to overcome is the politics of what happens when those interfaith or interfaith dialogues don't happen. So a lot of churches or mosques don't agree with folks being queer or don't recognize trans identities. But the people I'm with in the streets and the people that we're attempting to protect and uplift and amplify are those people. So those, hopefully you can understand the question I'm asking is how do you navigate that? Because it sounds like in your church there's something that you all are attempting to do at least.
Thank you. I think, real quickly, what we try to deal with is start from a place of a human perspective. And as a human being, everyone in this room, everyone, does not want to have someone punch them in the face for their existence. Everyone in this room that has a child, be they straight or gay or whomever, does not want to fear every time that kid goes out that they're going to come back bashed in the head. We all understand on a human level, on an emotional level, what that looks like. And if we can get together just on that, you don't have to like anyone if you don't want to, but we can get together on what it means when people we care about, or even if we don't care, are hurt for no reason except their existence. Now, some of us, from an ancestral level, know about that. Some of us know about it. We got 500 years of knowing about it, just by the fact that we exist. So I think if we can get there first, if we can start from a place of recognizing that this is a person. No, I don't like your purple hair. Maybe. No, I don't like that you have a dress and you're a man. Except I do know this, no one has a right to try to kill you for that existence. Because especially if we're coming from a place of faith. Because there isn't a faith that I'm hearing for 2 days that is about hate. There isn't a faith that is about that. It's a faith about love. It's a faith about helping people understand that God loves them as they are. It's a place of helping young men and women, folks know that they are something that my mother used to say all the time. And I never understood when she prayed this. You are God's property. You are somebody. She would say that all the time. And I get it now. Because she didn't say it, you, the black woman, you, the black man, the straight person, the white person. You, as the person, are God's property. So if we can get to that place of humanity where we can see that the trans person that was hung or beat up is just not right, just because it's a human being. And we can just do that piece and talk to each other from a place of not violating another human being, then that's where we start. And that's what God would want us to do, I think.
Thank you so much. This has been a very, very robust dialogue. I pray no one's offended. I pray you feel empowered. We've had some excellent speakers. Would you please celebrate these panelists with us tonight?
Bless you.
Dean David Grafton is coming back.
Just going to echo something that Khalil Abdullah said yesterday, and that is thank you for taking the time to come and be here, to invest in this. I want to thank all the speakers, the keynotes, and the panelists for the incredible work that you all do in your own way, in your own places. It's amazing. It's humbling. I want to thank all of the students who worked hard to put this on, and the staff that set up this place and got things ready, the microphones, the projector, everything. So a lot goes into this. And as wonderful and enriching as this was, it's only beginning. And this was the easy part. And the hard part comes now as you all go back. I've received a couple of cards that people have passed to me about the work that they do and interest in Hartford Seminary and the work that we do, and that's what this is all about. And we know the law school very well. We have people come over all the time, so there's no strangers there. So I encourage you to stay around a little bit and pass around some more cards for your future work. And for those who would like to avail themselves of the chapel for Maghrib, please do so. And thank you very much, and peace be with you, and safe journey home. Oh, one more important, very, very important. You will all be receiving tomorrow via the email that you registered with. You'll be receiving an evaluation. Please do take the time to fill that out. It's a SurveyMonkey. Please take time to fill that out so that we can hear your voice about this program and future programs for the Luce-Hartford Conference on Christian-Muslim Relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Oh no, I was soaking it all up. It was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Of course. What a wonderful time. Great. Really grateful that we would like to hear about it.
Yes, we did.
Oh, for sure.
Yes, you
for
did.
Sure.
Yes, you did. How are you? Yes, I was sitting at the desk.
We have more work to do in about an hour.
Yeah. I didn't say that. Yes, I did. Yeah.
Appreciated your comments.
Thank you.
That's my school.
You went to
Yes,
so I was
yes.
going to ask you when
Yes.
undergrad.
Yes.
Yeah. It was nice to meet alum. Do you ever come back to the reunions and things like that?
I missed the last one that the African Culture.
That's right.
I wanted to come back, but I missed it
Yeah.
because I got the information after the fact.
Oh no.
Yeah. I was one of the founders of the Black Student
Right,
Association
right.
way back in
Yes,
the 80s.
yes, I do remember when you
I
came
didn't
in.
know that.
'Cause
Yeah.
I looked up when you said you got
I still got a lot of the old
I'm coming out there.
library.
Yes.
A lot of the people we had to come and Dick
Thank you.
Gregory.
Oh wow.
Thank you.
I had Miss Black Yukon Banquet.
Yes.
I had all of that stuff.
That's fun. So it started in the 80s. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
started in 1990.
And the BSA
I'm trying to go back.
in the 80s.
Tonight, yeah.
Ernest Day and Lloyd
Yeah.
Bass and
Yeah, but I'm enjoying it, you know.
Arthur, what's his name?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
I shouldn't forget his name.
That's fascinating. It's a
Something
recent
deep.
history.
Archie Treat, something like that.
Oh.
Yeah, he was
Okay.
the director at that time.
That's really it's
It all
recent to
started
think
with
about.
what's called the Black House.
Yeah,
Black House is one of the
come on down there. Come on. We'd love to have you.
Culture Center, and it became the BSI.